Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming to today's event. We'll go ahead and get started in just a minute. We're just going to wait for a few more people to join. Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute. Just going to wait for everyone to join. For everyone that is already here, if you are an SDSU student, you can go ahead and scan this QR code to enter a drawing to win one of two Starbucks gift cards. If you are an SDSU student, go ahead and fill out the Google form. It will also be in the chat below. Okay, so I think everyone, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Go ahead and switch to so the purpose of LSU is to unite, educate, and empower Latinx students through the celebration of culture and the promotion of positivity, mentorship, purpose, and awareness in all that we do. We're going to go ahead and listen to the Kumeyaay land acknowledgement.
We can't hear it.
Kumeyaay people.
Can you hear now? Oh.
Hoka, Noshkana Unachihi. I'm the tribal liaison of San Diego State University, and I'm now going to read the Kumeyaay land acknowledgement. We stand upon a land that carries the footsteps of millennia of Kumeyaay people. We are a people whose traditional lifeways intertwine with a worldview of earth and sky. In a community of living beings, this land is part of a relationship that has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced the Kumeyaay people to the present day. It is part of a worldview founded in the harmony of the cycles of the sky and the balance in the forces of life. For the Kumeyaay, red and black, represent the balance of those forces that provide for harmony within our bodies, as well as the world around us. As students, faculty, staff, and alumni of San Diego State University, we acknowledge this legacy from the Kumeyaay. We promote this balance in life. as we pursue our goals of knowledge and understanding. We find inspiration in the Kumeyaay spirit to open our minds and hearts. It is a legacy of the red and black, and it's a land of the Kumeyaay. Yeah, Khan, my heart is good. Your womb, your patches.
Okay. Once again, we want to thank everyone for coming to our event. Now I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to our special guests, Dr. Griselda Rodriguez Solomon and Dr. Miguelina Rodriguez, also known as Las Brujas de Brooklyn.
Hi, everyone.
Greetings.
Saludos. Oh, hold on. Let me stop the share. Let me pause it. You're good? So on your screen right now, can you all see us? Our Prezi.
Yes. We can see the
Everybody-
presentation.
You can see the presentation?
Yes.
Oh, there it is. Hi, everybody. Just analog girls in digital worlds. We are the Brujas of Brooklyn. My name is Griselda Rodriguez Solomon, Dr. Griselda Rodriguez Solomon. I am Dr. Miguelina Rodriguez. We are identical twin sisters, Black Dominicans from Brooklyn, New York. We're very excited and honored that we were asked to hold space. Gri and I, we're always fascinated when we chat with our West Coast Latinx, Black family. There's so many similarities, but there's these beautiful nuances that highlight like the differences, and it's always so nice. Even your accents, I'm like, oh, I like this. But before we start in line with honoring the traditions of the First Nations people out in the West Coast, we want to start by honoring the Lenape, who are the first indigenous peoples that cultivated and still are present in this land. We are from Brooklyn, New York, and that is the indigenous group that predominated here before the advent of colonialism. And as Dominicans, as having legacies of the Taino and Arawak lineage in our blood, we acknowledge all First Nations people, all indigenous people around the world, because we stand on their land, on our land. Today, we are really excited to have a chat with you. So we're gonna just use a visual, a Prezi presentation, because we're educators, we're both professors for the City University of New York system. And we are very in line with the attention span of university students, but also as students of life ourselves, we love to be engaged. So we're gonna share a Prezi while we also talk to you about something that's very near and dear to us and to most, if not all Latinx people, which is anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness and in a broader way, anti-indigeneity, but today we're focusing on anti-Blackness. Specifically, we're going to be speaking about colorism. So we're going to go ahead and start the presentation, and we definitely want to hear from you all. So jot down any questions, put questions in the chat, so that when the Q&A opens up, we could really have a more interactive perspective. I just wanted to share just a little bit about ourselves, so you know who you're in the presence of, who is holding space. As Griselda said, we're both university professors within the City University of New York. I teach at the community college level. Griselda teaches at a four-year institution, specifically senior seminars. I teach urban sociology, so urban studies, immigration, gentrification, neighborhood change. And one thing I did want to share is that we are both graduates from the State University of New York, a specific school, Binghamton University, and we were both very much involved on campus. We were part of different student groups. I was in the Caribbean Student Association, and just being here is like nostalgic. It just reminds me, we weren't virtual, not only because we weren't in a pandemic, but we weren't also like, this wasn't a thing. We're old. You know, we're almost 40. But it's also like the camaraderie and the community that really held us down in these predominantly white spaces. So being part of these cultural groups was so integral to like who we are today, to helping us graduate, helping us stay upstate. It was very cold. We experienced micro and macro aggressions, and these cultural organizations really held us down. So thank you all for having this, inviting us, and being there for the community. Yeah, it's kind of bittersweet because I'm like, I was getting dressed a little while ago and I was like, oh, we would have been getting ready to have this in person. All right, let's. And we keep looking over here. Her laptop is here. Oh, I see. And bear with us. So as Griselda said, please drop any questions, comments. We leave time at the end for Q&A, mainly for comments more than questions. And I think we're ready. Yeah, so this particular conversation is around healing anti-Blackness among Latinx communities. As quickly, I don't know, someone is not muted and it sounds like a little bit of like muffling. If everyone could just check. You're on professor mode. Okay. I am on professor mode. It's also so everyone can hear the presentation. You see it stopped. So some of you all, I know Nora, shout out to Nora Leyva. Thank you for facilitating this, for inviting us and finding us in a sense. Some of you all may know us through our platform, Brujas of Brooklyn on social media, which is a wellness platform centering on womb wellness among women of color. We're open to all identified peoples, but our particular scope is on womb wellness. So today we're gonna have a conversation around how anti-Blackness in the form of colorism shows up and affects the Latinx communities. And then we're gonna briefly talk about how that then shows up with regards to maternal mortality or racism in maternal health, because I'm a doula, which is a birth assistant that supports people, women, while they're giving birth. But bigger than that, Black and brown doulas are known to be advocates because of the history of racism and anti-immigrant sentiments that are legacies of the professionalization of medicine. And I think just to add on to that, I'm very much in the doula birth world because Griselda is a doula, a lot of our friends are. And there is a big conversation right now about the use of the rebozo, which is an indigenous tool, especially in indigenous Mexican communities, and how white women have been using it in their own practices to help women, people with wombs, give births. And now there's this conversation about cultural appropriation. We can talk about the rebozo is like, for those that don't know, it looks like a very big scarf or shawl that indigenous people, women have used throughout millennia to support women while giving birth. I've used it in my own practice as a doula, and it really does decrease pain and really helps support the person in the process, especially of natural birth. But now, indigenous women, rightfully so, want their props. And these white collectives usually make a lot of money by promoting these indigenous practices without necessarily giving props and also supporting these communities. So today we are gonna do two things. We're gonna focus on what is colorism and how does it manifest among Latinx communities. And then we're gonna briefly, like I mentioned, touch on the way in which colorism shows up with regards to reproductive injustice. So if anybody here is a woman or a gender non-binary person but still has a womb, this is a very significant conversation. And even if you don't, right, you may be in the presence of someone, you may have a child with someone, a woman, a person with the womb, and it's just about understanding how this phenomenon of anti-Blackness, racism internalized among the Latinx community is not just about believing that people have bad hair or good hair, or being told that you should marry a lighter skinned person. It really does trickle down and really affects women in very profound ways. So colorism. Colorism. So this is a conversation. Any of you that follow us hopefully know that Griselda and I, we've been having the last couple of months. I feel like we did a lot of work around anti-Blackness and racism, but specifically anti-Blackness in the Latinx community. But this year specifically, colorism has been the topic that Gri and I, myself specifically, we've been forced to sit with and really navigate and understand our privilege as lighter skinned Black women, right? A lighter skinned Black women that did not understand or identify as Black until later on in life, and the privileges that offers us. So what colorism is, it's a form of bias within specifically in this context, the Latinx community, specifically as it relates to the color of a person's skin. And this isn't, as Griselda just said, not only about discriminating against somebody, the hue of somebody's skin or the texture of their hair. It goes down to reproduction. And maybe I am in professor mode, like maybe in the chat, some of you can share if you all directly or indirectly have received messages from your family to mejorar la raza, right? To improve your race, your lineage by marrying or procreating with someone whiter, lighter skin, with specific features, usually European-like features. But colorism also affects a person's livelihood, as Griselda mentioned, with mortality in terms of maternal mortality, but it also affects your standard of living in terms of the jobs you receive or you don't receive, whether you gain admission into a university setting, right? There's all this research conducted on statistically proven that white scholars tend to look at lighter skin people of color, in this context, lighter skin Latinx people, as more intelligent than our darker skin counterparts, therefore sometimes offering us admission at higher rates into university settings, especially at the graduate, doctoral, medical school level. So yeah, colorism, it translates into, it's a form of racism, as Miguelina mentioned, that it's like a hierarchy where the lighter your phenotype is, or your hair texture is closer to what is perceived to be more European, the higher up you are in the hierarchy, because your proximity to whiteness affords you a level of privilege that is not necessarily the case as you go lower in the rung of this hierarchy and those that are of darker skin. Also, outside of colorism, Latinx identity is very complex. As you can see from the image, these are two images from the previous election cycle this past November. On the top left, it says Latinos por Trump. And on the bottom right, it says Latinx for Black Lives Matter. So you can't really pigeonhole the Latinx community into one political realm, or you can't say that Latinos are one thing with regards to race or identity, because we are a multiracial ethnic group. And I think that that's one of the main things that we're going to start with before we get in deeper, because I hope that a lot of you all, especially that those that are politically and socially active on campus, have had these conversations. But as a professor that teaches ethnic studies some semesters, I find that a lot of students really don't know the difference between these terms, because especially the Spanish language media and the English language media to a certain extent convolutes, or it really flattens the identity into just being Hispanic, right? So Latino is I'm gonna start with Hispanic. It is the identity that was granted to Spanish-speaking people, specifically Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, around the 1960s, when the United States started to notice an influx of Spanish-speaking people entering and really progressing in the United States. I mean, it's also a result of the Civil Rights Act, because folded in the Civil Rights Act was the Hart-Celler, or the Family Reunification Act, which opened the doors to immigration quota-free to individuals all over the world, but specifically Latin America. So we were arriving, we spoke Spanish, and we weren't white. A lot of us weren't Black. And it was like, what do we do with these people? And the Nixon administration was one of the first, but then it became official during the Reagan administration to identify us as Hispanic due to our language and our heritage as descendants of people from Spain, right? But then among the Southwest population, where you all are at in particular, there was a lot of political movement and mobilization because of the civil rights movement that wasn't just isolated in DC. And although it was very much central to the African-American experience, most communities of color, from Asian and Pacific Islanders to Latinx communities, started to galvanize in a similar way to really also call forth and highlight the issues that we were experiencing as marginalized beings. And there was a conversation around, what do we want to identify as? Because we don't want this government to identify us, but we also don't want to necessarily hone in on just the Hispanic, Spanish heritage part of our identity. So Latino was coined as a way to really lay claim to the fact that there's indigeneity and Africanness that are very much central to the Latino identity. And then come Gen Z, or the younger millennials, started to develop another way of promoting a more expansive, inclusive notion for the Latino community, but with Latinx, that really came into the sphere of common lexicon, like around 2004, as far as it was like creating a little bit of buzz, but it wasn't until the 2010s with the advent of social media that you had this term. And Latinx is very much, it's more US specific, but my favorite anecdote about the way I chose and I learned about the significance of this term is that Spanish is a gendered language. So but it's masculine dominated. So if we're in a group of, in a collective group and it's all women, we say Latinas with the A, right? And if it's all men, we say Latinos. If in the entire group of women, one male identified person or one man comes into the group no longer becomes Latina, the group is now Latino because the masculine is the standard. If in the group of all men, one woman comes in, the group still remains Latino. So this is one anecdote, and then it also lays, it really supports trans communities, gender non-binary communities by putting the X on the end.
One thing I did want to say is, two things I want to say. Spanish is not an identifying marker. It is the language that most of us speak,
Yes.
But it is not who we are. I don't know how it is, to be honest with you, on the West Coast, but on the East Coast, when we have incoming freshmen that are like 17, 18, 19, and I teach in Queens in the most diverse college in the country, LaGuardia Community College, like we are the most diverse, race, ethnicity, language, religion, nationality. So I have Latinx students from all over, you know, the Western Hemisphere, and they walk in like, Miss, I'm Spanish. And then I have to like break it down and help them understand these three terms. And even deeper than that, this is a US context, right? Outside of the US, Latinx is being contested. Now Latine is a new thing. Latin is Latine, Latanie. I was just schooled by one of my students. I was just schooled by one of my students, Rashawn, right? But even deeper than that, going back to the work that we do, holding space, really dabbling in spirit, we really are teaching this not to like pit people against each other, not to make one group feel superior than the other. It's just to help you understand who you are. And I'm not gonna sit here and say, at the end of the day, we're all human. We are, but we're not with the all lives matter conversation, but we are very big on understanding that there are certain differences that need to be highlighted, because personally, on the East Coast, a lot of like Latinx folks, we don't identify as Hispanic. It's something that we just don't identify with. And it's not that it's offensive, but I will correct someone and say, no, I'm not Hispanic, I'm Latinx. So I'll be like, you know, I'm from Brooklyn. But within this context, we just want you all to understand the context that it's US based. What happened?
No, this is like, it's fascinating. This is Latinx 101. So then now that this was a very brief, but I think important intro to the distinguishing markers of identity among Latin American identified peoples in the US, when you really understand that Latinx is a multiracial ethnic group, meaning that it is not a race. Unfortunately, Univision conditioned us to believe that there's la raza latina, or the Latino race, and that comes from a nation building legacy around the 19th century that is very much rooted in anti-Blackness, because there was so much racial mixture because of the, you know, sexual violence that was very much present in communities of enslaved people all around the Caribbean and the coastal cities and ports all over Latin America. Those that were the leading figures in nation building projects in these budding Latin American nations really didn't want to identify with one particular race, and they chose to really have us all identify with this Latino race, or la raza cósmica, right? Vasconcellos, which was an American, like, a Mexican, like, philosopher that has been criticized for this idea of a cosmic race, even though it was probably well intended and beautiful about we are of the stars, but at the end of the day, some stars are not treated very kindly.
And I could be, I'm of the stars. Yo soy de la raza cósmica. Yo soy de la raza cósmica, but I'm also like a Black Latina woman in the United States, right? So I think that we need to understand that we could dabble in both, but these extremes where it's like, we're like forced these labels and that's like all we are, and then people trying to tell you what you are, or like, we are all a cosmic race. I think that that's dangerous territory, either extremes, and we really have to dabble in that gray area.
So this is a study in 2010
that really, and related to a Pew Research study from the mid 2010s that really tried to understand the way that Latinos experience life in the US. And as the title reads, for Hispanics, experiences with discrimination differ by skin color. Side note, when we deal with statistics, right, we were both researchers, statistically, the data still refers to our group as Hispanic. So that's why it's there. So just pardon with us, because we just 2 seconds ago, we were like, we don't identify as Hispanic. And it says Hispanic there because the literature is still using that terminology. So this was a survey conducted in 2019, right? And it says, it asks the percentage of Hispanics who say they personally experience discrimination or treated unfairly because of their race or ethnicity. And all Hispanics said, 49% said time to time. Lighter skinned Latinos said, 43% said that they do, and then darker skinned Latinos were the ones that predominated when asked if they believe that they experience discrimination because of skin color. 84% of Latinos believe that Latino internal discrimination is problematic. This is from a research in 2010, meaning that Latinos, when asked, do you think that there's issues among Latinos? 84% of us say yes, either because of skin tone, because of hair texture, because of accent. There's nationalist beef too,
Yes.
like between like Dominicans and Puerto Ricans.
And I think honestly, keeping it real, Dominicans, we don't really play football. We don't play football or
I
soccer.
think we're the only, and Puerto Ricans.
We play such a colonial sport. Anyway,
Baseball.
well, it's really not colonial because it has indigenous
yeah.
roots, but then it was like budding and it morphed in the United States. But on the West Coast, I know, you know, our like Mexican, Central and South American family takes soccer, football very serious. That also oftentimes pits countries against each other because it takes nationalism, like nationalism takes center stage. You know, people are playing, it's not a game, they're playing, it's like personal, it's history, right? And it is all fun and games until like a soccer or football match turns violent, because even that is like internalized discrimination.
And it's often racialized. Like there's been tons of headlines about the darker skinned players in Ecuador and Brazil, you know, and other countries, Chile, really coming out and expressing their concerns about being treated poorly by the fans when the team is losing or even when they're not, just because of their skin color.
One thing I did want to add to this conversation about Latinos believing internal discrimination is problematic. This is not limited to anti-Blackness. This is anti-Indigenous movement that I wasn't as privy to, being a Dominican woman from the East Coast, attending colleges that in terms of the Latinx community, it was mainly Dominicans and Puerto Ricans. Then I started teaching at LaGuardia Community College over a decade ago, where there are not many Caribbean Latinx people present. There are a lot of Central, especially South American students, and them teaching me about colorism within their community, but in terms of their indigenous ancestry, it was like, whoa, this
Right,
isn't limited. And then my South Asian students, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi students, telling me that they experienced it too. And then me digging into Bollywood, right, which is significantly larger than Hollywood. And all of this, these are remnants of colonialism.
Right, it's these structures that were set in place by European powers that are still very much alive. And unfortunately, because of the way oppression works, oppressed identities internalize our own oppression, and then we're pitted against each other. So you don't need the proverbial slave master over you, controlling you. The control happens psychologically, and then we kind of like become gatekeepers within ourselves, whether it's gender, like, you know, the community policing women certain ways, whether it's with skin color, darker skinned people being treated poorly. It's like the oppressive structures are maintained oftentimes because of the laws that sustain them, but also the beliefs that we internalize. So Afro-Latinos, this is also really complicated because there's this budding movement of sorts where Latinos are claiming to
The
be
Latinx population.
I use Latino and Latinx interchangeably, and it's just done unconsciously. But this budding movement of Latinx people claiming that they're Afro-Latino, but they're not Black. right? Saying like, I want to identify with my African ancestry, but I choose not to identify as Black because Blackness in the US has been reduced or has been limited to just be associated with an African American experience. And that's understandably so, because African Americans were enslaved en masse in the United States, and they've created like a legacy of resistance and established a culture for themselves. But then with the advent of immigration, especially post-World War II, you had a lot of Black people from all across at the continent of Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean coming into the US, and that complicated this whole notion of Blackness. So this is why, again, in another Pew Research study in 2014, out of those that identified as Afro-Latino, 39%, the majority identified as white. So you see how tricky it gets, where like ethnicity and race are often used interchangeably, but they're not, right? The Latinx community within the US, I don't think we clarified that it's an ethnicity, right? It's an ethnic group. Yeah, it's multiracial ethnic group. But ironically, out of all those that were surveyed, Dominicans first and then Puerto Ricans of all Latinx communities were the two top groups that identified as Black. And that makes sense when you look at the percentage of people of African descent across Latin America. The bulk of Latinx people that are of African descent come from the Caribbean, because that's where most of the slave ports were, you know, at the turn of like the 15th century. And also in Brazil is where most of, and we know that Brazil and Haiti are often the two countries that people are like, and Guyana, like, are they Latino? Are they Latin American? French Guyana, Belize. So there's a lot of countries, but that's a whole nother conversation. One thing I did want to touch on is being a professor for the last 10 plus years. This conversation, like these stats that you're seeing right now, it used to annoy me and upset me because I'm like, how are they identifying as white? And it's because we're not taught about race in this country. It's a very racialized country. It's a very racist country, but we're not taught about race properly. So then you come to a class like ours where race is central, and Latinx students being the main students, right? The majority of the students that are in our classrooms, not knowing how they identify. And I remember one of my first semesters teaching at LaGuardia, I asked a student, was he Hispanic or Latinx or Latino? And he's like, I'm Hispanic. I'm like, okay, tell me why. And most of the time, students can't really tell me why they identify as Hispanic. This particular student said because Univision said so. And I remember being like, Dito, like, really? Like, I mean, that's how powerful the media is. But he said that is what, boom, you know, that is what Univision said. And if you're going by that, Papito, like you be significantly misinformed. And this is all by design. I mean, my particular niche in regards to critical race theory is understanding the way oppression works, racialized oppression, and the fact that we don't have candid, honest, sophisticated conversations about these different terms and the way racism works is very much intentional, because it's almost like if you know how the machine works, then you can dismantle the machine. Somebody is not muted again. If everyone could just make sure that they are muted. Thank you. Yes, my professor mode is gonna come out. So racism is learned behavior. And why did we choose to focus on this? Because as Miguelina mentioned in the beginning, we grew up, you know, our trajectory was like, we were Dominican, and then it was like, we were Hispanic. And then we went to college and we learned like, no, not Hispanic, Latino. And then Latinx wasn't a thing in the early 2000s when we went to school, way back in the olden days. But then we, you know, we started to increase our racial consciousness and understand our identities as Black Latinas, Black Latinx folks. And we started to come down really hard on our family. Like my family is Black, is like phenotypically darker skinned Black Dominicans. Miguelina and I are like on the lighter side of most of our families. So we were perplexed, like, how the fuck, like, how are you saying that you're not Black? But then you look Black, you experience it like it ain't looking Black, they were Black. And our aunts and uncles have all passed, and my family looks very Aboriginal, or like South Asian, more Aboriginal. My mother's brothers specifically were all very, very dark, but they have very fine, like thin hair, right? And in Spanish, they would be like, yo no soy negro porque yo tengo el pelo bueno. You know, I'm not Black because I have good hair. And it was like holding on to the least bit that they could hold on to. And I remember being like 23, 24 years old, going deeper into my racial consciousness and being like, what the fuck? Like, why don't they just come to terms with that they are Black? and it gets deep, you know, it's very deep, like learning about cognitive dissonance, you know, Frantz Fanon, really helping people understand that this is a psychological situation that is going on. Not only that, in the Dominican Republic specifically, there was a modern dictator, Trujillo, Rafael Trujillo, from 1930 to 1961. And compassion really helped me be more at ease and like back off on my family and really show compassion. And one of the things that helped me shift is, if it were me, I too may show up the way my family does. And when I present this to my students, they're like, nah, me, miss, I will never be as racist as my grandmother. I will never tell my grandkids to marry a white person to like improve our lineage. You say that now within the context that you are operating under, but these individuals were in a very different country, in a very different era, and a different government.
Violence was often used to really enforce anti-Black, anti-Indigenous sentiments across a lot of Latin America. So this is important to consider when you realize that people are not born racist. It's not an excuse to not hold people accountable, but racism is a learned behavior, and you learn it, you know, we're sociologists by training, you learn it in socializing agents like the family and schools and religion. But this example that we're giving is the media. You know, this show, I've never watched it, but Made in Mexico, it's like, I've been to Mexico, and this is not the majority of the people that I saw in Mexico. You know, La India Maria, I'm forgetting her name, which is bad, but for those that don't know, she was like a caricature of,
we're gonna put respect on her
what
name.
Indigenous people are perceived to be in Mexico in particular, like aloof and dumb and, ay Dios mío, ni de aquí ni de allá. She doesn't know.
I don't know if they even know who La India Maria is.
Yes, some of you may be younger, but you ask your parents and they know.
Maria Nicolasa Cruz.
Yes, Maria Nicolasa Cruz. And then the bottom left is, of course, well, now, of course, Carusel.
And I really want to pause here. Someone's saying, I remember. I want to pause here because for Griselda and I, these two characters, right? Cirilo, the dark skin.
And Maria Elena.
Filomen.
No, Maria Elena. Maria Fernanda.
She was so petty. She was so mean because he loved her. So this was Carusel. For those who remembers Carusel, can someone let us know in the chat who remembers Carusel? It was like a kids telenovela that came on after school, and they were in this private school. And one of the sub stories was Cirilo, the dark-skinned little boy, was in love with Maria Elena, whatever her name is, and she always shunned him. And there was one episode, I had to be like 8 or 9 years old, that I remember vividly. He was daydreaming that she would fall in love with him. He shows up with like a white face with like a fucking George Washington wig on. Sorry, with a George Washington wig on. And he shows up to this ball, and she like, you know, goes, you know, swoons over him. She falls in love with him. And someone's sharing in the chat. Oh, thank you for sharing, Fanan. You know, and Carusel, think about it. If we were 8, 9 years old, we're still like a little bit removed, but still kind of in those formidable years when we deal with psychology. And this is like being ingrained in our psyche. La India Maria, like she was the first and maybe only Indigenous main character I remember growing up. And being Dominican on the East Coast, we watched a lot of Mexican television because that's what dominated in Univision and in Telemundo, because those are the only 2 Spanish language channels that we had in the media. And like Gris said, her character was like, really like, I'm gonna be honest, she was portrayed as dumb. Just like, oh, aloof and funny, but there was not a lot of like texture to her character. And this is how racism is taught. This is how racism is internalized among Latinos. This is how colorism is reinforced, where the protagonist and the good characters in most novelas or movies were always lighter skinned, closer to whiteness or white, nevertheless. And the villains, the witches, the brujas, this is another reason why we're reclaiming this word of brujas, witch in Spanish. The villains were either indigenous or Black, or if they were white, they were the more Mediterranean white with the dark hair and the more olive tone. So there's always these subtle cues that are being portrayed via the media that we internalize subconsciously, that really has us believing, unfortunately, in this idea that, like, you know, you can have good hair or bad hair. On the bottom, there's this thing, Dominicans say it a lot, negro pero fino, like you're black, but you're refined. Oh my gosh, she's so pretty for a black girl. She's so pretty to be dark skinned. Those are just ways. And again, this is not just Latinos. And an example of internalized racism, colorism being one, is Eva Longoria was in hot water a few months ago because of she was being interviewed about the election and how the Democrats were able to like pull through in the end. And the reporter was saying, rightfully so, how Black women, African-American women in particular in the South, really galvanized and really pulled through, especially with Georgia. And she was caught in like a heat of the moment response, Eva Longoria was. And it's like, yeah, Black women, but we really have to acknowledge Latinas because they were the ones that really, and of course, considering that we live in cancel culture, she was dragged, rightfully so, but I also, we're very big on like having healing conversations. And then she came out with this apology, but unfortunately is an example of how insidious the internalization of colorism is, that you could be well-meaning, you know, she's very political. I didn't even realize how politically active she is and how much she's about like equal pay and equal representation among Latinx in particular. But this is where intersectionality comes in. Like you can be gung-ho for like the Latinx community, but you talk about us as an ethnic group, but you don't talk about us, the racialized groups within us. You don't really talk about indigenous Latinx folks. You don't talk about African Black Latinx folks. There are people in the US today, right, that they claim to be, and they are indigenous, where they're like, I'm not even Latina, I'm not Latinx, right? But the conversation needs to be complicated a little bit more. And with Griselda and I, we're very big on, you know, really laying the foundation and respecting our elders. And within the context of this conversation, our elders are African Americans, right? As marginalized groups, however you identify, if you identify as any group besides white, we really have to pay homage to African Americans, specifically those all enslaved Africans, you know, formerly enslaved, but specifically during the Civil Rights era, because that's where policy really changed. And like I said, within the Civil Rights Act that Lyndon B. Johnson and Martin Luther King Jr. signed in 1964, the Family Reunification Act was folded in there, along with so many other like acts like the Fair Housing Act, right? But the Family Reunification Act directly impacted somebody who's listening to my voice right now, because maybe somebody in your family petitioned for you to arrive to the US. We are like secondarily affected because our mother is a product of it and our family members, and us being born and raised in the States, you know, we benefited from it. We are both McNair scholars, an African-American astronaut whose family started, is it an endowment? I'm not sure, but it's a program for first generation students of color who are pursuing doctoral degrees. Right. And we have to understand that. And I think that if Eva Longoria had a little bit more compassion and knowledge about this, she wouldn't have said what she said. Do we need to big up the Latinx community in the political economic climate of the US? Absolutely. But there's a time and there's a place. The same thing with Gina Rodriguez. Yeah, that's next. You know, and unfortunately, it plays into the proverbial oppression Olympics, where it's like, oh, no, there can't be too much spotlight on one of us being racialized groups, so-called racialized minority, another identifying marker. We do not identify as minority. Please, if you identify as minority, reconsider it, because minority, you put a spell on yourself when you speak. That's why they call it spelling. Words have power. There's this Japanese researcher, forgetting his name, that did research on the molecular structure of water when you pray over it or when you dam it. And the molecular structure changed in a very profound way, where when you prayed or spoke positive into the water, the molecules were very fine-tuned, almost snowflakes, and the water that was dammed and there were negative words on it, the molecules of that water were very murky and disfigured. So we're 70% water, and we're very much about increasing your vibrations by the words you speak to yourself. We're not minority. I understand why the use of that term, because white folks are still the majority. That soon is going to change. But a person of color, you know, a BIPOC, Black, Latinx, Asian, however, just please do yourself a favor and empower yourself by putting that word to rest. Like minority, I'm saying. So this is Gina Rodriguez wanted to get a group. Somebody, I just wanted to acknowledge the chat. A group of she wanted to bring badass Latinas in Hollywood. Some will argue that Gina Rodriguez and Eva Longoria are different because of Rodriguez's history of cultural appropriation of Blackness. Yeah. Right, and apologies, we're not trying to like group these women under the same category. We're just using them to illustrate examples of ways, directly or indirectly, well-meaning or not, that there is this colorism within the Latinx community. And a lot of times it's not even within our own community, is Latinx people towards Black African Americans or other Black non-Latinx groups. In this case, this picture is an example of colorism, intra-colorism within Latinx folks. As you can see, there's really not many, or if any, there's some brown women there, but nobody phenotypically Black, phenotypically dark skin. And this is not even like deep brown. This is like an example of what the media perceives Latinas in particular to look like, when the majority of Latinas across the US do not look like this, right? So think about a little girl that is looking at television. Things are changing, thank God. But in the last 10 years ago, you know, a young girl watching television is very gendered, not really seeing herself. Or I would see myself a lot as a lot of your ages, you know, late teens, early 20s, as like a video vixen with my ass all out, you know, and being exploited sexually. I didn't really see women that look like me or darker skinned women at that. And if we are present, it's usually in the tropes of like the sassy Spitfire, or like highly sexualized, or like, you know, the which I do not like the show, never liked it, Scandal with Kerry Washington. Like, you know, she was gonna come and clean up Washington, and she was always snapping her neck and telling people about themselves. So we're going out of it. Like, you know, the Issa Raes and the Lena Whites are changing that, and all these, like, you know, gentrified. We still need more folks to step up within the Latinx community, because it's not only indigenous people of Latinx descent not being seen unless they're in the India Maria category, but it is darker skinned Latinx people, right? It's darker skin, because it's like darker skin not being represented in the African American media. But then when there's more nuance when you look at the Latinx media. There's not a lot of darker skin Latinx representation. Griselda was interviewed last summer by Ida Calderon, Colombian cis. She's an anchor person. The first Black female anchor person in a Spanish, I'm like, major Spanish language news. I'm like, it's 2021. And no disrespect for what I'm about to say at all, but like, her hair is not like, it's not, it doesn't look like she wears it natural. That would be big if we could get some darker baby steps, mommy. Baby steps. Yes. I get excited. But, you know, segueing into now the subtopic about how then all of this is very important: historical, Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, and then how we internalize the oppression, racist oppression, and pit ourselves against one another based on skin tone, hair texture, whatnot, about being told to marry lighter and have lighter skinned children so that you don't like mess up the race, whatever that means. I was told that, we were told that all of our lives. But then how does that then trickle down into every day? I don't know, I'm being led. I don't know if we could do this, Nora. Can we take some questions? I don't know. Can we take a couple of questions before we move into like the second part of this? Because we covered a lot. And usually in our classes, we don't cover this much without stopping. And we just want to make sure people are like, you know, with us. So if anyone has comments, questions.
People should be able to unmute themselves if they want to ask any questions.
I want to acknowledge Nashima, when you said that when you moved to San Diego after living in Florida, your coworkers were Mexican, and you asked somebody about Black people in Mexico, and he said that there weren't any. Like I said, I'm not Mexican. The closest thing I know with Mexican culture is Univision, but having traveled to Mexico a few times, I often ask, oh yeah, ¿dónde están los negros? And they're like, oh, ellos viven en Veracruz. Veracruz is like the place that people in Mexico seem to believe that Black Mexicans live. PBS has a wonderful series called Black in Latin America, and there is an episode on Mexico, and it's fascinating. There are a whole lot of Blaxicans across Mexico. questions. We just want to make sure not only are Black people in Mexico, but there are Afro-Indigenous communities in Mexico. Absolutely. I mean, when we really trickle down to the more finite aspect of our identity, Miguel and I identify as Afro-Indigenous. And, that's because there's like this whole theory that all Indigenous people were obliterated in present-day Dominican Republic, and that's not necessarily true, but that's a whole nother story. While we wait for folks to pose questions, and now we'll move on. One of the things I did want to share before we continue is, it's what Gri was saying earlier, when we used to like police our family and call them out when they would say like really hurtful, like colorist, biased, racist things. And one of the things I'm learning, 20 years doing this work, 20 years really going deeper into my racial consciousness, is it's really important that we do the work on ourselves. And the way that looks for my sister and I is, as lighter skinned Black women, really identifying and highlighting our privileges as lighter skinned Black women, and letting people know that there are several privileges that come with our complexion, where there are dark skinned Latinas in this specific example. I'm going to get even more specific, Dominican, who have to prove their Latinidad, and they have to say, yo soy Dominicana, I'm Dominican, and people be like, ¿dónde tú aprendiste a hablar español? Where'd you learn how to speak Spanish? Because God forbid, a Black person can be of Latinx descent, where Griselda and I, our race was never ambiguous. Maybe to other folks, non-Latinx folks, but we were very much Latina when we entered a room, and we need to acknowledge that. And I think that if we want to make real change and strides, we start with that. And then I think that energy starts to vibrate higher, because sometimes, like Gria and I at the beginning of our journey, we pour from these half-empty cups, and we lead to burnout, and we become disgruntled, and there's a lot of justifiable angry activism, but we really need to come back to the middle and like inoculate this with love. And it really starts with yourself. And I'm not trying to be cheesy, but it really starts with self-love. It starts with knowing yourself first, because what's also going to happen, and maybe some of you have experienced this, people are going to tell you what you are. They're going to tell you what you are. A lot of people have been like, you're not Black. You're not Black. What do you mean you're not Black? And it really has to get to a point where none of that can faze you, because you're standing in your truth without hurting anybody, and also recognizing the privileges, because we all have privileges, all of us. It's about acknowledging those moving forward.
We did have a few questions when people registered. They entered their questions. One of them was, in what ways can family or partners and friends begin a dialogue to bring about healing?
Yeah, I mean, Miguel kind of like addressed the question. I think to start, before the like steps, if you will, it has to be rooted in love, right? There has to be an intention that no matter how heated, how complicated, how difficult the conversation is, whether it's calling out like the racist language that your family may use, or, highlighting the fact that you feel like certain family members treat lighter skin, whiter appearing family members better than darker skin, whatever the dynamic may be, that the intention is that there's reconciliation in the end. If it's just to attack, and if it's just to prove somebody wrong, that's going to be a circular conversation that's going to lead to very little progress. I mean, now if you speak to the same family member over and over and over, that's a different conversation. But I think if you would have asked us this question 20 years ago, Gria and I would have had a very different like, pop off. But now we're like, just be patient. Also, without pathologizing your family, one thing that has helped me is to really tread with a lot of grace and compassion, because we are working with a psychological phenomenon. I'm not saying that our folks are crazy or that we're crazy, but when you really understand the dynamics of race and racism and how it needs to be really ingrained in our subconsciousness for racism to exist and survive, then you can understand that we're dealing sometimes with folks that are not psychologically centered in their racial identity. So trying to shake my mother to be like, tú eres negra, you're Black, that wasn't working. And one of my mentors, may he rest in peace, Blas Jimenez, I would ask him a similar question that was posed. And he was just like, bring the positive aspects of Blackness or indigeneity to your family, invite them to a show, take them to a restaurant, you know, show them like documentaries so that they can start, because the thing about this is that we've internalized Blackness as in a dehumanizing way. So we've had to learn how to humanize Blackness or indigeneity so that our families can understand that when we talk in anti-Black ways, it's really dehumanizing others, but dehumanizing ourselves in the process. And I think with our family, like Risa, maybe like some of your family in terms of indigeneity or Africanness, in terms of Africanness and our family, they kind of moved away from that. Y mejoraron la raza. They improved the race, where our generation, meaning, is lighter. That's what I was saying. Oh, okay. Our generation is lighter, more European phenotype. And I think our family was kind of like, we went through all this work and now you're here and you're lighter skin, you're lighter than us. Why do you want to be with darker skinned men? You know, why are you claiming this Blackness? Why do you wear your hair this way? And it really has to be you showing up unapologetic. And like, and I'll speak for you because we do that all the time. My sister's married to a darker skinned African-American man. And y'all, our mother cried when my sister brought him home to meet her. ¿Por qué tú me haces eso? Why are you doing this to me? She called me into the room, speak to your sister, tell her not to date that man. And I appreciate, I know it was hurtful that my sister showed up and was like, I'm gonna date whoever I want. I'm gonna love whoever I want, versus like listening to that and saying, well, yeah, maybe I shouldn't be with this dark skinned person. 20 years later, 7 years married and a 6-year-old child. So this isn't only like theoretical, right? There's a lot of lived experience in the material that we cover. Any other related question, Nora, before we move on?
I think you've touched on the rest of them, because they were asking, you know, how does anti-Blackness show up on a daily basis? So you've mentioned some of the comments that not only your family makes, I know my family makes that type of comments. And then another one was about how to address, like, effective methods to address anti-Blacknesses when, according to this person, instances are so limited because of our homogeneous community demographic. But I think you've addressed that we're not homogeneous. It's just a myth, I believe. I don't know if you want to expand on that.
And these conversations are not just one-shot deals. You're gonna have these conversations over and over with your friends or family. And I'm telling you from experience, you save yourself a lot of stress. You save yourself wrinkles, because stress leads to aging. You save yourself just unnecessary drama when you really come to terms with everybody has a right to their own experience as long as they don't hurt you. And if you want to really come from a place of educating, or with the intention of educating your family, come with a place of love. And remember that just because there's anti-Black sentiments in your family, it doesn't mean that your family is like backwards or crazy, or there's no hope, or there's no hope. It just takes time.
Speaking of that, I don't know if, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, speaking of that, I don't know if you can talk about, it's easy to judge our families, but we need to recognize the effect that colonialism and capitalism continue to have an effect, especially on our elders and the things they did to survive, which is not something I think people from previous generations were willing to address, just the history and continued impact of colonialism. So what role do you see between that and where our families and our elders are now?
Absolutely. We have to realize that this is a white supremacist existence. People could fight me if you want, but the world is white supremacist, meaning that Eurocentric ways of looking at the world, Eurocentric ways of appearance, the business models, conversation. I'm gonna assign this really interesting article in a few weeks in my class about how even the way we mediate conflict. It's an indigenous scholar that wrote the piece. It's very Eurocentric. Like, it's like you talk, I talk, and then there has to be a resolution. That even that is foreign to, people that are not of European descent. But the world is very much rooted and driven in the image of a white man, right? And why is that important? Because then you realize that then that means that currency, right, value, what is success, survival is rooted in how much you can emulate being white, being a man, being cisgendered, being heterosexual, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So our families, especially in their respective countries that were very much tied to legacies of colonialism, learn through school, the media, education, religion, everyday conversations that whiteness, maleness, et cetera, could lead you closer to success than if you identified as indigenous or Black, or as a woman, you operated in more feminine ways. So and it's really complex. That's what I was alluding to earlier about compassion really being key here. Somebody said something in the chat. It really takes a lot of compassion, y'all. This is not for the faint of heart. We are up against Goliath. Because this is centuries of conditioning that we're trying to undo in a generation. And I think that it's important to keep that in mind, not to feel discouraged, but to remember, like Gris said, it's going to take more than one conversation. It may take you observing sacred silence, maybe not picking and choosing your battles, not biting the bait, because what also may happen is when you start to come around, you may have some antagonists in your family that say stuff just to get a reaction out of you. Our thing is when we first started on our journey and we would come around, our family would be like, es que delante de la melliza no se puede decir nada. In front of the twins, you can't say anything anti-Black. Like in front of anybody, you shouldn't say anything anti-Black. And I remember feeling a little bit insecure and subconscious about it, like self-conscious, like, oh my God, I don't want my family to feel like uncomfortable around me. Now I'm like, I'm here, hello. I dare you to say something like anti-Haitian or anti-Black, but even with that, when we show up like I'm here, there's still so much love laced within that. But this was a great question. Gabriela Esparza in the chat says, when you say to show the positive aspects of Blackness, some Black advocates argue that coming from that aspect of value, culturally, financially, politically, further places Black people in the road of commodities. How do you reconcile that argument? Oh, that's deep, very much so. And absolutely, that definitely was not where I was coming from, because I understand that argument and I'm with it 100% about, folklorizing Blackness, meaning that Blackness as an experience, as a political perspective, as a consciousness, because of just the history of white supremacy, especially in this country, has been flattened and reduced to folklore, like dancing, singing, food. So I know, Gabriela, thank you for that, why the question was posed, because I said, take them to restaurants, take them to a show. Absolutely, like that has to be more, that argument that I posed does have to be a little bit more nuanced. And in me saying like, take your family to like, for example, I would take my mother a lot to dance shows that show different dance troupes from across the continent of Africa. That was one example, but I would show my mother like documentaries about Black people in Dominican Republic leading revolutions. I'm very big on the Haitian Revolution. Almost in all aspects, when I'm speaking about just Blackness, it's about we can't understand Blackness in the world, but especially on this side of the world, without really understanding the essential role that the Haitians played in rising up against the strongest army of the time, the French, and really establishing themselves as the first free Black republic on this side of the world, right? I chose, and I personally, this was a personal choice, to really start small with my mother. The example I gave about the food and the dance was specifically for my mother, just to allow the experience of Blackness as I understand it to be a bit more, my mother to be able to embrace it bit by bit, but I'm very big on like being bold and unapologetic with embracing the fact that Black people are not just dancers and singers and good cooks. Like, we're revolutionaries. We created political structures that still influence many, many peoples around the world. But Gabriela, that was a really important question, and I think that, again, it's very easy, like in the Latinx context, to flatten Blackness and to say that Black people are just this. And that's what happens a lot across Latin America, like in Mexico, in Dominican Republic, in Peru, when they're like, oh, yeah, there's Black people here. Look, that's a dance troupe. Look, they dance. Or like, oh, we're not Black, but look, the African remnants of our ancestors, look, it's in the food that we cook. And yes, that is very much so, but it's a consciousness, it's a political motivation as well. And I think that that's a whole nother separate conversation about really sophisticating the conversation. But again, like I said, for me, when my elder, may he rest in peace, gave me that advice about he was more specific about, you bring Africa to your mother, right? That was his advice, whatever that means. And I chose to translate that in the way that I felt best, but never with the intention of folklorizing Blackness. Indigeneity, it too, like when you look at like Mexican culture, generally speaking, as a third party, right? A lot of times indigeneity is also folklorized to say that, like, oh, the Mayans had the copal resin, and they have the cenotes, and we have the cultural dances, but the reason why Mexico was able to progress.
Astrology, arithmetic, I don't know.
Right, but the narrative is that the reason why Mexico has been able to progress in every way is because there was a more Eurocentric understanding of commerce and politics, which is not necessarily true. But thank you.
Listen, like I said, this is not for the faint of heart. Griselda and I have a very deep spiritual practice.
Yes.
We practice Kundalini yoga. We meditate like savages, like beasts, because what we are up against is not for the faint of heart. And I don't want to grow disgruntled. I do not want to become a gatekeeper. Neither one of us want to. So we really meditate, because there's a lot of self-forgiveness work. We're going to mess up as we do this work, as you're going to mess up. And there's a lot of like calling out, gatekeeping, policing, which is necessary sometimes, but it's also important to like allow people to have like human moments. So when your family continues to have these human moments, remembering to check them and have conversations with them, but don't take pieces of you and hand it to them. Don't disempower yourself, and that's a delicate balance. And again, I go back to self-love. Self-love is one of the only things that's going to keep you in this beautiful, like, in the conversation, and bring people that you love, invite them to the conversation, and not be burnt out, because the burnout can be real. Because you could be a light-skinned Black woman, you could be a dark-skinned Black man, you can be an indigenous woman whose father is a quarter white, and people be like, well, you're not really indigenous. You can be born and raised in the United States of Salvadorian parents, and you understand El Salvador history, but you may not speak Spanish well enough. And they're like, well, no, ella no es Latina. She's not really Latina. It's always something. So it's very important that like we continue the work of self-forgiveness, and we continue the work of self-exploration, and allowing people to like navigate this with as much love as possible.
Oh yeah, this is tireless work, and we do it with a lot of love and compassion, because I know that I wish I had these types of conversations when I was coming of age, if you will, because I lashed out a lot at my family, and I was rude, and sometimes
I was gonna say
rightfully
so.
But sometimes now, like when I was pregnant, my family used to be like, oh, drink milk of magnesium so that your womb could be cleansed, so that your baby could come out lighter.
Put breast milk on his hair so that his hair could stay like thin and soft and good.
I know several people, and that is their particular choice, because they really want to draw boundaries that are like, oh, you're getting cut off. And I didn't choose that route, because I wanted my family to come into my sphere and really come into a place of love, to understand, like, you don't say that to anybody, but that's really coming from a harmful place, that you were taught to deny and denigrate and really hate Blackness, to the point that you will tell me to drink freaking diarrhea medicine, milk of magnesium, which is white, so that my womb could be cleansed. Why my womb is dirty? Because I'm carrying a Black child. I mean, it's profound, but like my sister said, it really, I've had to do a lot of work on forgiving myself and forgiving my family members.
Just to lighten the mood a little bit, the jokes that were being made about a heavy topic when Oprah was interviewing Meghan Markle, and Meghan was like that there were conversations about baby Archie when he was still in the womb, about what color he was going to be. And there were all these memes about people of Latin America being kind of like,
oh, we do that all the time. We're not supposed to do that.
That happens in our community all the time. But
But in line with the conversation on pregnancy, we really wanted to touch base and really anchor this theoretical conversation around colorism into the present, very real reality about what's going on in the US. The US sucks when it comes to maternal mortality. We have the most expensive insurance in the world. And yet out of industrialized nations, Canada, Western Europe, New Zealand, Japan, the US is the country where most women die or almost die while giving birth. And as you can imagine, these statistics are worse for Latinas and Black women in particular. And we're going to touch on something called the Latina Paradox, right? So a lot of you all, what's going on? I can see it here, but can't see it there.
Yeah, your screen is frozen. The pressy.
You want to stop share? Yeah, let me stop the share because we can see it on my end. But yeah, a lot of you all may have been aware in the media about Serena Williams and Beyonce both almost dying due to complications related to their respective births. There we are. By the way, we're in our mother's house. The very Dominican aesthetic. I like it. She didn't like it. I like it. We were setting up. I like it. It's not my cup of tea. But yeah, thankfully, this is an issue of maternal mortality or neonatal mortality that has plagued the US since the advent of enslavement of African women, because the offspring of African women will become property, right? The first time in human history where a woman's womb would become like a site for economic development, profit, right? I hope you all can see that. I think it's gonna work. It's going to work. Okay, there it is. So, right, Williams, what Serena Williams' scary childbirth says about medical treatment of Black women, and, you know, just trigger warning, there are gonna be some statistics that are very heavy and daunting, especially if you identify as a woman of color, especially those that identify as a Black woman, right? But these statistics are important because in order to find a cure to the ails of society, we have to know what is causing the harm, right? So Black women are 22% more likely to have heart attacks, 71% more likely to have some sort of like cervical cancer, reproductive imbalances, and are 243% more likely to die from pregnancy or childbirth related causes. That is not a typo, 243. That is not a typo, and that's because of a legacy of anti-Blackness, anti-femininity, very misogynist history of gynecological medicine in the US that still lives today. And then there's other factors that we're gonna touch on with regards to food deserts and malnutrition and access to low quality healthcare. So this Latina paradox, or the healthy immigrant theory. Ironically, I just taught this last week in my Latinx experience in the US course that I teach, where statistics show that there are relatively positive birth outcomes for newly immigrated Latinas, specifically Mexicans, which is accurate, right? But then within one generation, this erodes. And then Latinas, people with wombs that identify as Latinx, we start to move closer on par with other Black women. And this is perplexing, but it's also understandable, because going back to what we alluded to earlier about the measures of success, especially for my Indigenous family that's listening, some of us have close connections, or we're not that far removed from like parteras, midwives, from curanderas, sobadoras, women, men that did healing work with their hands, and women that had herbs, that had children at home, and herbs, and the postpartum period, the cuarentena, the 40 days after postpartum. And, you know, all these wives' tales, as we call them, that Gria and I used to hear growing up, like, don't do this when you're on your menstrual cycle. A woman after she gives birth shouldn't be moving around a lot. She shouldn't be going out. The baby shouldn't be exposed without their head and feet covered, right? Because we want to be more, quote unquote, like Americanized, and we want to reach this American dream and modern, we move away from those traditions, right? When we talk about colonialism and it being very much alive today, right? Colonialism is subtle in ways that our family talks about these like cave-like situations. My sister had caveman-like situation. My sister had a home birth. And for the first few months, she was telling people, I'm gonna have a baby at home. And our family are like from the bush, you know, they're campesinos from the mountains of the Dominican Republic, many of which them or their mothers gave birth at home. And my family's thing is like, why would you do that? Why would you go back, right? Instead of just being able to have a home birth in a modern facility in a hospital. Because again, I really like that conversation. And I was gonna tell you, please send me that article about the way capitalism, the way it like, you know, it permeates even the way that people negotiate. Capitalism permeates, especially in the way that we choose to give birth. It permeates in the way that we choose to heal ourselves. If we don't run to a hospital for every single ailment, and we only treat hospitals and allopathic medicine for trauma, as it initially was intended for. So this Latina paradox shows you that even with colonialism seeps in even into this, where, you know, there are women that, I won't even go into like cesarean sections. I'm not a mother, so I don't like talking about this as much, but I am talking about just like colonialism and this measure of success within the academic settings, you know, people majoring in certain things because that's what's gonna make us money. And my family wants me to be a lawyer, a doctor. You know, so you know how many students have told us like, I would love to major in sociology, but my family would never let me because they want me to major in finance and go and work, you know, and become a CEO and make money. And I'm like, do they ever talk about happiness? Do they ever talk about success and health? Do they ever talk about success and you being able to take time off when you want to? Because this American dream, this mythical norm, right? Audre Lorde tells us is sold to us. And for some Latinx and immigrant groups, it really becomes the American nightmare. And we're saying this as two, our mom was undocumented when we were born. We were born and raised on all the social services you can think of, born and raised in the hoods of Brooklyn. And we went through public school. We each have a PhD and we're professors at the college level. And we still assure you that sometimes it's not even worth it. Because you're gonna be successful in the US capitalistic frame, but are you gonna be happy? And sometimes you have to like disappoint your family to create your own happiness. Wow, I went on a tangent about this, but I let you be. It's what needed to come through. Came through you. But the ancestors were talking. But yeah, I think that's part of the paradox, because this idea to live up to the standard that our parents, if you come from an immigrant background or you yourself migrated to this country, it leads to all types of stress that really affect the way in which we experience birth. So the three main reasons why, as Miguelina stated, a generation later, and sorry, real quick, we can like shift this and juxtapose COVID on top of this, right? I mean, we can juxtapose so many other things when we talk about maternal health. We could talk about other things. But the three main factors that lead to this paradox, and how is it that Latinas that migrate to this country have better birth outcomes than their offspring or the second generation, is because of racism, right? Coming from, real quickly, why do the first generation have better outcomes? Because they often come from more homogenous countries where there is discrimination based on class or religion or sexuality and subtle forms of colorism, but not as intense as like the color line is drawn in the US. So you don't experience racism in Mexico or Dominican Republic, generally speaking, as profoundly as you would in the US, because in Dominican Republic, somos todo Dominicano, we're all Dominican, we're Mexican, we're Peruvian. And class is very big, right? Or classism, but racism as we know it and the way it affects your health, it doesn't really show up in such a profound way until our family migrate here. The second is toxic stress. Like Miguel said, trying to live up to this American dream, but also acculturating, trying to juggle multiple identities, multiple cultures, you know, that sometimes negate themselves. Your family, your elders wanting you to speak Spanish or practice a certain religion, and then you learning or establishing your own identity, and then there's tension, or, you know, your family trying to help you get through college and pay through college. There's a lot of stress associated with that, and then diet. Those are three main factors, right? A lot of working poor people of color tend to live, and middle-class Black people and Latinos live in food deserts, which is, you know, very limited access to fresh food. And that's changing, but that's coming from a history of redlining, which is, pre-World War II, the government literally put red lines around neighborhoods that they wanted to disinvest in, and white flight happened, white people left and really isolated those neighborhoods to the point where there was disinvestment. And I just read something really interesting yesterday that traditionally redlined neighborhoods in the United States, California, New York, we have less trees, and in summer months, the neighborhoods can be 5 to 10% hotter than other neighborhoods because there weren't any trees planted. So then Arlene Geronimus is a researcher that is known to have coined this phenomenon called weathering, which says that stress that impacts people of color, that's chronic and repeated, can really affect our well-being. Think about the way you feel when you believe, or when you actually are being followed in a store for being perceived to be stealing, or when you're being followed by the police, or when somebody makes a comment about your skin color or your hair or the way you speak. That nervousness, that tension, that rage, the way your heart races, if it happens enough, it's almost like subtly, it's like the weathering of a rock in the bottom of a riverbed, that those rocks can be jagged, but as the water passes through it in like 10, 20, 30 years, those rocks become smooth. That's what happens to our body when we experience consistent forms of stress. Like if you're undocumented, like, I'm assuming like the belief that like any corner you're gonna turn and ICE is gonna pop out and deport you, that can really weigh heavy. I mean, being queer and being in the closet, if you will, and not wanting to face homophobia, that can make you sick. But literally, racism makes us sick. And because of that, racism making us sick, and then coming within allopathic medical institutions that have a legacy of racism and sexism, those two combine and really lead to the intense maternal mortality rate that we have in the US, right? So low-income women, undocumented women, women that don't speak English often have even more extreme experiences with neglect and near-death or death experiences. I just saw that last week, this young woman, like 21, passed away after having a C-section. Most women that die due to birth-related complications die because of the complications associated with a C-section, right? So that's a whole nother story. The World Health Organization says that for a nation to be viable, the C-section rate should be no more than 15%. And in the US, our C-section rate is close to 30%. Because dinero, right? Look at this image on the bottom right? It's like pregnant people with different coins in their bellies. Women of color fare worse than white women in every aspect of reproductive health. African-American women, US-born Hispanic women, very specific, right? US-born, low-income women who receive Medicaid, and less educated women are more likely to have pregnancy-associated mortality. This is from an Amnesty International report that came out. And these are important conversations because even if, what Grisela said earlier, if you are not pregnant, don't plan to get pregnant, but you do have a menstrual cycle, you do have a womb, this conversation is important. Even if you don't have any of the above, understanding this is extremely important, because these are ways that we are still being controlled, right? Gria and I do womb wellness related work, really helping people with wombs, people who menstruate, tap into their menstrual flow in a way to regulate it and not succumb to like the irregularities that a lot of us experience as Black women, as women of color, fibroid rates being significantly high, irregular bleeding, endometriosis, PCOS. Right, and these things, right, as social scientists, we connect our social science training and background with our spiritual and like, homeopathic, if you will, experiences working with different elders to help people with wombs, women of color specifically, understand that if you want to really start to shift this narrative, because these statistics can be very, very like they could kill a mood. They're daunting, they're sad. My students are like, I feel overwhelmed reading about all these things. One of the ways that you stop or like at least curtail the feelings of being overwhelmed is really empowering yourself and really going deep and going back to like ancestral knowledge. And I appreciate that we're talking to our family on the West Coast, because you are way more connected to your indigenous roots than we are. Just because where you are, will always be Mexico in our eyes. And right, energetically speaking, your country, the indigenous populations were able to endure colonialism more than the indigenous populations where we are from. So like lean into that. Speak to your abuelitas, speak to your abuelitos, speak to the elders in your family. You probably have a curandera that's in a closet somewhere that doesn't even want to share she's a curandera. He's a curandero because of the shame. The shame, and y qué va a decir la gente. And this is, to wrap up, this is all tied to the colorism conversation, because when you look at the statistics, I don't know where that information is, but when you talk about Black maternal mortality, those statistics are just focused on race, rightfully so, because it is darker skin, right, Black women that are experiencing forms of neglect and discrimination because of the anti-Blackness that is still not just a Latin American thing, but very much a US thing as well. And then Latinas are not necessarily highlighted, Black Latinas in those statistics. And then when we look at the Latina Paradox that say, oh, Latinas are doing better than even their white counterparts with, having babies full term and high birth weight and low C-section rates, those are not disaggregated by race. So we don't know how Black Latinas are doing in those statistics. So Black Latinas are like somewhere in limbo, right? I want to believe that we may be folded into the Black statistics, but if a person is led to choose their own identity because of what we just finished speaking about the legacy of Eurocentric whiteness and white supremacy, a lot of Latinas are less likely to identify as Black, even though they themselves present as Black and live life within a very Black experience. So then they often lead themselves to be erased within these statistics, which are very important because statistics like the census data really drive policy and inadvertently lead themselves to be erased. So it's very much about like understanding that we were existing within a society that has a legacy of anti-Blackness and misogyny, misogynoir, as this term has been coined to really look at the way Black women in particular, and even more finite than that, like dark-skinned Black women are treated poorly when compared to lighter-skinned Black women or to white women. And then within that, the anti-immigration sentiments and homophobia, all those factors intersect, where our particular communities have to really equip ourselves with knowledge, with doulas. Hire yourself a doula, get a doula, encourage people to get a doula, a birth assistant, if you're choosing to go and have a hospital birth. Not right now, y'all. I was gonna say, like, eventually, like in 15 years, health is very politicized in the US. Like Miguelina pointed, the COVID pandemic is a great example. Latinx people, Black people dying at disproportionate rates when compared to our white counterparts, not because we are inherently sick and we have sick genes, is because we come from legacies of people, epigenetics, that have been enslaved, that have been discriminated against, and that stress, it has been proven, is biologically transmitted from one generation to the next. Not for you all to internalize it and be like, oh my God, well, we're doomed. It's not that. But it means that now we have to move with more caution and more presence with stress levels, and reducing stress and drinking more water and making sure we eat healthier and we really express ourselves when something racist or sexist or anti-immigrant is said, so that stress doesn't live in your body, to try our best to curb the possibility of these illnesses really showing up for us in the future. But things are changing. I mean, we're here. This conversation is happening. The narrative is shifting. These are just examples of Black and Indigenous Latinx people that have made a mark and are making a mark across the media. I chose media because we focused earlier on how the media teaches us how to be anti-Black. But there's a lot of Black Latinos, Indigenous Latinos that are really coming through and saying like, nah, like, we're not about to flatten Latinos this way, and we're not about to flatten Blackness either. And we're here, I just wanted to end with this brief collage of Black women, right, in particular, that are really doing big things. A Latina, Jenna Martinez, a Garifuna, Honduran, Black Latina, that has a growing following, really touching base specifically on darker skin Latinas, and how they're often overlooked, misrepresented within the Latinx communities. Elizabeth Acevedo, Black Dominican author, New York Times bestseller. Carmen Mojica is a Black midwife, Black Dominican midwife. Love her. She's really about advocating for the rights of all peoples, no matter how we identify, to birth in a humane way. Ancient Song Doula Services, a social justice collective in Brooklyn that has made a lot of noise with creating policy to make sure that less and less Black women, women of color, have to die or almost die while giving birth. And then us, we're here. We're leaving our little grain of sand in time. So we wanted to thank formally the Latinx Student Union, the African Student Union, and Nora. Thank you, Nora, for facilitating
so
this.
much.
Let me stop my share. We'll stop blabbing so that we can hopefully get into a discussion. Here we are. Why isn't this?
If you have any questions or comments, you can drop them in the chat or just unmute yourself.
How to spell doula?
Gribu, type it in the chat. How do you spell doula? D-O-U-L-A. D-O-U-L-A. It's a funny word, but it means a birth assistant or attendant.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I know it was a lot. But we're very passionate about this topic, and we were given a lot of time, and we wanted to make sure that we covered a lot. We don't profess to be experts of anything but just our own lives, and we teach what we know, and we really intend for this to be a heart-centered presentation, conversation. We're also available through, DM if something comes up, and on Instagram. Yes. What happened? No, DM what? Oh, I thought that was like, it was a given. I didn't have to say a DM on Instagram, but Brujas of Brooklyn, BRUJAS. And I think Nora shared our information in the chat. Yeah. If you have any questions, you can send us a DM. We manage the account, so we're both very active. Somebody will get back to you within a matter of a day, maybe less. Because, these types of things, when you chew on it and process it, that's when a lot of the questions start to come up. You may be shy, you may not know what you want to ask. So we're definitely making ourselves available for after the conversation. We keep looking here because we have a computer here where we can see the grid.
I think Maria is going to lead us out, but I did just want to thank you both for being here with us, and to everyone who's joining us. Thank you for joining us, but I also do want to make sure we're all accountable for our responsibility and we acknowledge our privilege, especially for those here with lighter skins. In this case, we were lucky to have an SSF grant to be able to hire Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Rodriguez Salomon, but it's not on Afro-Latinx people or Black people to teach us how to do better and how to challenge our own internalized racism. So I encourage you all to do the work. If you don't know where to look, where to start, you need resources, feel free to reach out to me. I'm available. In this case, we did compensate our speakers today, so thank you so much for being here. Yes. But it's just know that it's not on Black people to teach us about anti-Blackness and white supremacy. It's on us. So I don't know.
Nora, and I just wanted two things. Somebody had a question, but before that, I really wanted to thank you for bringing up that point, really centering the conversation on privilege, because we all have it one way or another, and not being ashamed to acknowledge that privilege and use it to like push the movement forward in ways where you're not hogging the mic, right? You're not like only talking about yourself, but like if you're in a room and you are the darkest person in the room and somebody is relative, right? Right, it is very relative. And somebody says something extremely colorist or racist, for you to call that out in a loving way. We've been asked to talk on certain topics that we don't feel comfortable, we are not equipped to talk about. We pass the mic and we're like, such and such and such and such and such and stuff. We try to really center dark-skinned Black women, dark-skinned Latinx women, because they have a lot to say, because their lived experience is very, very different, more traumatic than our lived experience. Right. With regards to racism and colorism. And the last thing I wanted to say is I really appreciate your conversation on compensation, and thank you for compensating us, because it still fascinates me that this day and age, at this time, we're still, and many people are being asked to hold this type of space. And it's like, well, that's not in our budget. And my sister and I, it's like, or not necessarily in our budget, but like, oh, we don't, we're being a little bit unprofessional, but we're being honest. One thing that people know, it's not unprofessional. This is part of the conversation. On more than 1, 2, 3 occasions, it's like, oh, well, we passed this idea through our budget committee, and they really didn't see, in the sense that they didn't see the value in investing a couple $100s in these particular cases for the type of work that we did. And we're going to be very honest, and this is a word of advice for all of y'all. We've turned down invites in those cases. We do stuff for free all the time, but when it comes to dynamics like that, like, oh, you didn't see value in this, then okay, then we won't do it. Or major corporations, like, and I think that the more we keep showing up unapologetic and lovingly say no is a complete sentence, right? The more that we really we flex our muscle and we really make people reconsider this. So thank you, Nora, and thank you to the student organizations for hosting us. But somebody did have a question. Kathleen?
Yes, you mentioned about how the stress of second generation or later generations Latina and Latinx is more traumatic than the first generation Latinx.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to know more about it.
Yeah,
especially
so that
across different racialized groups.
Yeah, I could definitely speak with regards to Latinx folks, but in the brief research I've done with regards to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and there's not a lot of statistics on Native Americans, but there's similar dynamics where you would think that if your family in particular is coming from a country that they may be fleeing political persecution or economic hardship, if that's not all Latinos come to the US fleeing some type of persecution or economic hardship, but generally speaking, that tends to be the case, that you would believe that that means that they are sicker and more stressed than like their kids who are born and raised here. Generally speaking, that's not the case. And part of it is because, like I explained earlier, our parents or the older generation, they had community very central to their identity, and that really saved them from having to experience stress in a very raw way. And the universe, real quick, will have it that we're technically the second generation, right? Within the academic literature, those of us born and raised in the US, or you arrived to the US before the age of 12, you were raised here, we're considered the second generation. Going back to this conversation about success, we tend to move away from our cultures and our communities, and hopefully that's changing and we're becoming more community oriented. But the US is a very individualistic society. It is you, your partner, in a heteronormative sense. So me, my husband, my kids, and like my dog sometimes takes precedence over an aunt or a godparent or a godmother, where in all cultures of color across the African Asian continent, in Latin America, we were literally raised like it takes a village to raise a child. That's how most of us were raised. And then because of industrialization and progress, we move away from that. And that does have an effect in the way we fare in life in general, especially when it comes to being sick. I'll be honest, even like home remedies. You know, we move away from home remedies because, again, we look down on that. Like, I'd rather take a Tylenol than drink all these herbs and this tea, because we've been conditioned to believe that that's like savage, and we have to like be more civilized and more advanced and go to hospitals. When, again, unless it's for trauma, we can do a lot at home if we continue to lean into like the elders in our family, regardless of whether you are from Latin America or the African continent or Asia. So yeah, thank you for that question. It's a paradox, meaning that there's still a lot of research that has to be done, but I see it myself as a doula. I've been a doula for 9 years now. And as a researcher doing work on birth justice, that the effects of extreme stress related to the racism in the US and the way that people of color experience racism in a very institutionalized and consistent way in the US does really wear at us and makes us sick. I always ask my students, go to the place in the moment where you thought you were being followed by somebody in a store, or you were accused of stealing, for example, because you were the darkest person, or you were the only Latina in the store, or whatever the case may be. And it's like, they're like, oh, my heart races and my palms sweat and I feel something in my belly. Those are all physiological responses to stress related to racism, that if they happen long enough, they lead us to have like heart related diseases and hypertension and diabetes. And think about if you're a woman, that intersectionality on top of that misogyny. And then if you're lower class, again, so much that has to be taken into account. Or it's not even that these stressors induce these illnesses like diabetes and hypertension. If it's already present, it only exacerbates it. So our call to action before we wrap is to please be mindful about taking care of yourselves. I remember being a college student and eating pure shit. Did you all see that article about Mountain Dew? I drank a lot of Mountain Dew in college. No. Somebody complained to Mountain Dew that they found parts of what they thought was like a rodent in the Mountain Dew, and it's a Pepsi company. And Pepsi was like, supposedly that's not possible because the rodent would disintegrate inside of the Mountain Dew. So again, our call to action, take care of yourselves. I drank a lot of Mountain Dew in college, ate a lot of pizza, slept 4 hours. Oh, to sleep 4 hours again. Seriously, take care of yourselves. Take care of yourselves, hydrate, really pace yourselves, use any extensions. Like if professors offer extensions, don't abuse it. But if you're feeling burnt out, say, hey, I'm feeling burnt out. Ask for help, pace yourself, start your work on time if you can. And more importantly, love on yourself and love on the people around you. We miss college. We miss undergrad. It was only 10 years ago. So if folks don't have any questions, Nora, I don't know. You said that somebody was going to wrap up.
Yes, thank you so much, Maria.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maria. I'll be sharing my screen shortly, and thank you so much to the Brooklyn Against for once coming and sharing. It was very informative.
Yes, our pleasure.
Is it possible to ask one more question? Is it time?
Go ahead.
Yeah, we're okay with it.
And you mentioned that the racism, the anti-Blackness racism in the South America and also the Central America is less serious than those in the United States.
Not necessarily less serious, it just looks different, right? That's a very important question, and it can lead to a whole nother conversation, but race is not one-dimensional and it's not frozen in time. Racism, pardon. So it looks different based on where in the world it shows up, and it looks different based on what point in history it's showing up. So there is racism that shows up across all Latin America that is white supremacist, meaning the darker skinned you are, the more discrimination you would face. But the argument in a Latin American context is that nationalism helps to reduce the amount of stress that is felt, or buffer, almost put like a barrier between yourself and the way that level of racism affects you psychologically and emotionally, because you are conditioned to believe that we are all Dominican, we are all Colombian, we are all Mexican. So if you feel that you are being mistreated because you are dark skinned, because you are Black, which is probably the case, racism is not necessarily presented as clear cut as it is in the US. Like the world knows that the US is a racist country. In Latin America, there's been a denial of that racism. So people could get away with saying like, oh, it wasn't because you were Black, it's because you were poor, or it's because you lived in this part of the country. So this is why racism looks different across Latin America than in the US, but it's very present and people are afflicted and affected by it, but not at the extent in which we see it institutionalized in the United States. That's what I was going to say. It's coded into law. So like the US and
South Africa are the two countries in modern history that have institutionalized racism, meaning Black people were not allowed to drink from fountains, sit in front of the bus, eat at counters in the United States, like in South Africa. And that wasn't the case for modern history. Colonial Latin America had very racist laws, but post-independence, you don't really see that across Latin America. The racism is de jure, meaning that like it's in everyday experiences that people really experience racism because of the beliefs that are anti-Black, but not because they're like instituted into law. And I think it's, I'm trying to explain it, it's so complex, but no, I think that was good. It's also like, if you're fed a racial democracy, yeah, or race doesn't exist, right? As some Latin American countries. Because racism doesn't exist in Mexico because los americanos son racistas. You know, the US is the racist country. Peru is not racist. The US is. That's how Latin American countries have been able to get away with saying they're not racist. I mean, some Latinx nationalists accuse us second generation, you know, US born folks of like indoctrinating Dominicans and Mexicans with this idea of racism, because that didn't start in Mexico. It didn't start in Colombia. That's a US disease. And I'm just like, okay. But again, because when you're fed this racial democracy, again, you may experience biases and you may determine it has to do with class. It has to do with you being from La Sierra, like from the valley, and you just discriminated against, and you may not necessarily understand that it is racialized. But I think I really appreciate what you said is the institutional, systemic form of racism that I think we need to really hone in on. That's really good questions. Like, can y'all be my students?
Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you. De nada. De nada.
Okay, so I'll be sharing our upcoming events. I'll be sharing my screen again. Can y'all see my screen? Good?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. So for upcoming events, on April 19 at 5 p.m., we'll be having Cindy Zuniga Sanchez, and she'll be talking about financial workshops. So for the April 19 event, she'll be talking about budgeting and saving as a workshop. If you want to check her Instagram out, it'll be on zero-based budget. And on April 21, she'll be presenting again at 1, and she'll be talking about how to be debt-free, as many of college students find themselves on debt when they study. So this is a cool workshop to check out. And if you want to take a picture, feel free to take one, and we'll also have these on our Instagram as well. And now, as mentioned in the beginning of the workshop, we have an opportunity drawing. So for those who might have entered a little bit later, this is for SDSU students, and you'll be entered to win one of the 2 $10 Starbucks gift cards. If you want to, feel free to fill it out if you haven't gotten a chance, and we'll give you a minute. And shortly I'll be presenting who's the winner.
Just to clarify, you do have to be an enrolled SDSU student for the opportunity drawing.
Okay.
Meanwhile, I do have one more question regarding, are there any like routines or habits of self-forgiveness practices?
Hi, great question again. Yes, one of the best suggestions is journaling. I know it may seem strange to some of you all, but self-forgiveness practices, writing yourself a letter. So dear, I think your name was Kathleen, right?
Yeah,
Like dear Kathleen or dear Nora, dear Griselda, and then write yourself a letter to yourself with regards to what it is you want to forgive. Or you could write somebody else a letter that you need to forgive. You can keep the letter in your journal, or to make it more profound, you can take the letter. If you really want to release that energy from your aura or your energy body, you can burn it safely. Safely. We really recommend, Kathleen, that you follow us on Instagram, Brujas of Brooklyn, because we offer workshops and other ways in which you can incorporate healing modalities into your daily life. But journaling is a very powerful tool, because writing in pen and paper helps to manifest states of being. And then when you write a letter to yourself, you can retroactively go back and forgive yourself or your parents or whomever you need to. That's another great question.
thank you. I will
Yes.
remember.
Okay, so now I'll be sharing my screen